Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 771, September the 15th, 1986. For those of you who want bibliographies of these broadcasts, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to me in care of P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California 93922. If you send an envelope once a month and put which month you want the sheets for, you can collect the sources of information that I use on the air. Wall Street Journal had a large editorial this past week, September the 9th, War in the Shadows, and it cites our confrontations with the Soviet Union, with terrorism, spying, drug running, hostage-taking, and comes out and says that war is in the shadows. And all of these strategies of tension have been built up for the purpose of escalating what the Defense Department and the CIA wanted since 1943, which was World War III. And the buildup of those events is just about pouring over now until we will be ready to stage this war that they are so anxious for. The newspaper, the front page of the San Francisco Examiner and the Los Angeles Herald this past week, September the 11th, 1986, had these titles. On the top of the page it said, State of Siege. Pinochet sends tanks after assassins. Then there was another large column, State of Terror, and below there were three columns. One, Pakistani detectives lay out dragnet for hijack accomplices. That's from the New York Times. Two, Sharon, eat words, linking quotes, that's a statement attacking Prime Minister Perez regarding the synagogue bombing in Turkey. And then three, Paris, Cologne, and Holland, all targets of terrorist bombs. And then below it says Fullerton man's death at the hands of Karachi hijackers, and it tells about one of the people who was killed, Mr. Surendra Patel, and how he was the victim of one of the people killed. There were several from Los Angeles who were killed, and he had been on a trip to India, and he was one of those unfortunate ones that didn't survive the terrorism in Turkey. I'm going to try to reduce a lot of the things that you have seen and heard the past week and a half in the news as quickly as I can, because to take every article would be laborious for you, but I've outlined them and I've come to certain conclusions about what is going on, and I want to summarize these for you. On August the 31st, the headlines were about Mr. DANILOFF from U.S. News and World Report being arrested by the KGB. And prior to that, August the 22nd, was the gas that exploded. There was a loud explosion, poisonous gas that killed over 1,700 people in Cameroon, although the world didn't know about it until August the 26th, and it was 5 days later the arrest of DANILOFF. Then following the DANILOFF arrest, August 31st, September the 6th, was the Pakistan hijacking of an airplane that had come from India to Pakistan. And September the 7th was the shootout at the synagogue in Turkey, where a large number of Jews were praying and were gunned down. And September the 7th was the evening that Ronald Reagan got off of his eagle's nest perch, where he'd been sitting for 3 weeks while all this violence was cooking up, and went down to Los Angeles to kick off the senatorial campaign for Ed Zschau. The allies who assisted us in these agent provocateur activities, they were our allies, Mr. Zia, Pakistan, and the NATO officers at Turkey, or the Defense Department with the CAMEROON experiments, or the CIA and the Soviet Union. These were factors that worked for this control, the world order control, eventually to have a world war where they can wipe up the people who were in their way, the leftists, the liberals, and make that attack on the Soviet Union. The victims, of course, were always the third world kinds of people, people from India, on that particular plane, Jews in Turkey, blacks in Cameroon, and the Democratic members of the Senate. Now that's a simplistic reduction of a cause and effect, but Hitler came to power through the Freikorps, through violence, through lying about the Reichstag fire, for lying on the causes to Poland, the whole series of election processes that made it possible for Adolf Hitler involved assassinations and lies and covert actions, and we have to look at those parallels or ask some questions about these events. Now, the arrest in the Soviet Union not only was of a reporter, but it was a total media event and will be until we're just tired of hearing about it. As I say, August the 31st is when Mr. Daniloff, Nicholas Daniloff, reporter for the U.S. News and World Report, was arrested. San Francisco Examiner, this is September the 9th, had an article, USSR says Daniloff was a CIA go-between between a Murat Naderbog. He was a CIA chief in Moscow, and he was U.S. counselor for regional affairs in the embassy. He left Moscow last summer, and later they also named another CIA agent person that he was working with in Russia. Foreign Minister Gennady Gerasimov, I don't know if I pronounced it properly, described CIA schemes where he collected information of military nature, participated at instruction of CIA spy activities to establish clandestine relations with a Soviet citizen with a view to transmit information to the United States. Now, Daniloff was there under U.S. News and World Report. Lee Harvey Oswald went as a defector from the United States and worked at Minsk Radio Factory. But interestingly enough, as soon as he got home from the Soviet Union and was at Fort Worth, Texas, he hired a Mrs. Bates as a secretary, and she testified that she typed up notes and installations about airplane sightings and railroads and military installations in the Soviet Union. So he was able to procure a secretary and was observing information of a military nature. So if Oswald as a defector could be doing that, there's no reason that Mr. Daniloff couldn't be doing the same thing. The interesting part about Daniloff, and there were so many articles this week, the most interesting to me was Mrs. Daniloff's diary, the story she wrote. It was published in the U.S. News Report. It was reprinted in the Chronicle, the San Jose Mercury, and I just want to give you a bit of her account because it tells you so much about the whole affair. She said Nick left at 11 o'clock in the morning to meet Misha, a friend, incidentally, we've never heard from since. I don't know if the Soviet Union arrested him. If these were two spies working together, why arrest one? We've never heard where Misha is. He goes to meet Misha, who lives in another town. He knew him 5 years ago, saw him a year ago. And the excuse for seeing Misha, she said, was that he was thirsting for United States knowledge and wanted modern American literature. So Nicholas wrapped up paperbacks by Stephen King. Well, you know there's something wrong right there. If you call Stephen King American literature that he's thirsting for, there must be microdotting or something. Stephen King's books are just filled with violence, and for my sake, I don't call them American literature, not worth risking your reputation about. At 5 o'clock, Philip Taubman, Taubman from the New York Times, went to Mrs. Daniloff's house and said, did you know an American correspondent was arrested? So she didn't know, but a New York Times reporter told her. So the New York Times knew first and told Mrs. Daniloff. She hadn't been called by her husband or the embassy. The question is, why would the New York Times be the first one on the spot to know about a reporter being arrested? The KGB aren't that open with American reporters, I don't presume. At 5:30, 30 minutes later, Ruth Daniloff went to the office of U.S. News and World Report, where her husband worked, and he was on the telephone talking to them. And so the New York Times knew, and Daniloff called his newspaper. Then she refers to Jeff Trimble from the U.S. News Report, calling the American embassy in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union hadn't heard anything about Daniloff's arrest. So the U.S. News and Daniloff and New York Times, this triad and Mrs. Daniloff, had assembled a news media operation that would go to the jail and make a scene, and the American embassy suggested that they don't do this. It might put pressure on them, and she said she didn't care at all about what what the Soviet Union thought, that she would go and bring the press. So she got, through a telephone grapevine, a whole lot of people to go there. And then she said, thank God, Nick had the presence of mind to call the office first, that's the U.S. News, and not the embassy. Well, I would think that if he were suspected of being a spy, that the Soviet Union would call the American embassy first. This is a business between two countries, but they let him call his newspaper because she said already then the press corps was dialing the number Nick gave me and the number of the KGB, and they started a phone barrage and press conferences, and at this point she didn't care what the American embassy said. The world must know what's going on. Nicholas must know that, and his Soviet colleagues must know that the world press are behind him, and the message and foreign policy is conducted in the press. Well, so much for that. It took off like wildfire, and the press has been carrying it ever since. Now, last 2 weeks, I've been doing opinion based upon government experiments on Cameroon, and that I believe that was a neutron bomb tested down there or a chemical weapon that killed over 1,700 people. I'm not going to do much on that. That event was simply clouded by the other news, although 1,700 in this case died, which is worse than the synagogue or the hijacking. It happened simultaneously with the visit of Prime Minister Shimon Peres from Israel. I just want to give you two articles that came out this week, and then I'll fill in the Cameroon material next week. One was the San Francisco Examiner. This was on September the 14th. Cameroon has a mystery. The gas is a mystery. The International Investigation Team, looking into the cause of a huge cloud of gas that rose out of the volcanic lake, have found no answer to the mystery. The cloud, it was the cloud that killed over 1,500, it was about 1,700, prompted many theories on what happened. We cannot identify any other causes than a single cause, which is a combination of causes to explain the occurrence. And then September 13th, New York Times said, gas victims may have died quickly, within seconds. Scientists have tentatively concluded carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide caused the death in Cameroon. A second AID team was sent to find the cause of the blast. They've been unsuccessful. No evidence of volcanic activity, earthquake. We don't really know. Explosions preceded toxic clouds, and there were chemical burns on people. As I say, I'll do a lot more on that. I want to get on to the terrorism and the elections and the participation of Ronald Reagan and what all of this other violence means. Not that this isn't important. Cameroon is a very big, important, probably the most important of all the other stories, but it is being buried by a lot of the other news. Jack Anderson had a small section of his column, September the 2nd, referring to Africa, the home of the plague, pestilence, drought, famine, locusts, and now toxic gases, and he refers to starvation in Sudan and other horrors. Now, the Pakistan hijacking was the next event. There was the Cameroon, and then the DANILOFF arrest, and then the Pakistan hijacking, which took place September the 6th. Mr. Zia of Pakistan is a close ally of Ronald Reagan. He needs money. He is cracking down on his opposition members, and Mrs. Bhutto, he released her from prison, but he's cracking down. He's getting more despotic and desperate than ever, and he's identical to Mr. Pinochet of Chile, another one of our allies, who are no more nice guys, who have never been, but are going to get meaner as the activities escalate towards this big confrontation that all of them are really hoping for, to wipe out the people they really don't like. And that's where the poisons from Cameroon will be very useful in their hands, and it is in their hands. Now, the enemy of Zia, of course, is India, and the plane for the hijacking emanated in India. I just want to cite the titles of about 7-8 articles regarding the hijacking with not too much comment, and I think you'll get a picture of what I'm seeing. September the 6th in the LA Herald, Huntington Beach resident Rajesh Kumar, Kumar, was singled out. He's been a United States citizen just since July the 11th, and he had gone to India to pick up his aunt and grandmother. But the headlines and under it go into the fact that he was singled out. Houston Post, September the 7th. Hijacking puts India at odds, and it tells about the conflicts they've had before, and the hijacking makes it worse. September the 8th, this is San Francisco Examiner. Grandmother of Kumar came from India. She was returning with him to California, and the family didn't know where she was. She was missing, and they didn't know in the hijacking what happened to her. Then the California family found out that not only had he been singled out, the first person called and gunned down, but that his grandmother had been murdered and cremated, and the family hadn't even been notified that she was dead. This is in the hands of Pakistan, our close ally. September the 9th, the People's World. Pakistan tied to Indira Gandhi murder that took place October 31st, 1984. This is an article of the role of Zia in Pakistan. Zia, put in power, of course, by Henry Kissinger, and the Sikhs were the first suspects because shooting into the temple there, this would be vengeance for Mrs. Gandhi for shooting into their temple in India. But arming the temple with drugs and money came from Pakistan and the CIA and Mr. Zia. So an article just came out last week of the links, or 2 weeks ago, to Mrs. Gandhi's murder to Pakistan. July 7th, 13th, this is preceding by several months before Ronald Reagan took his vacation. Pakistani leader meeting with President Ronald Reagan. He met with him in July, this middle of July. The big topics of discussion were Afghanistan, where the CIA is throwing in millions of dollars, and drug trafficking. Reagan is starting a $2 or $3 billion attack against drugs, and Mr. Zia is one of the largest suppliers of drugs into the United States. People's World had an article September the 6th, 1986, titled, "All Four Terrorists at the Pakistan Airport, led by hijacked leader Gomer Hussein, Hussein." And the article goes on that Hussein was registered at the Perugia University in Genoa in 1984. Perugia University for Foreigners is the crossroads of fascist terrorism. Fascist Mehmet Ali Agha, the man who shot at Pope John Paul II, was enrolled May 13, 1981, just prior to his attack on Pope John Paul II. It is a center for CIA, Italian secret police, right-wing business circles. And the article goes on, weapons for the hijackers, acquired by Pakistan, had been used previously to hijack Indian airlines in the past. They came from a West German firm, delivered to Pakistani police and the intelligence. The Karachi hijackers used Pakistani air security uniforms and insignia to get aboard the plane, the Pan Am airliners, suggesting a lot of collusion, and I believe there was for very good reasons, but I'm just citing this article. The Houston Post, September the 6th. Pan Am claims the airport is to blame for the security lapse. 10 days earlier, they received a warning that this was going to happen, that got word that there would be clever impersonation of security guards by gangs of hijackers, and the security was, of course, was not there to stop the hijackers. In Greece, when they were involved with hijacking, or they used the Greek airport to have a hijacking, we called off traveling to Greece, reprimanding them, not landing United States airplanes there. None of this with Turkey. They did us a favor by creating the situation so that the people in charge were not going to stop, and they had warning of it. Another article, September the 7th, from the Houston Post, commandos delayed 15 minutes after the firing started. They waited that long. And the San Jose Mercury, September the 10th, officials' confusion led to the rescue. They knew the generator was going to give out, the batteries of the generator, when it was dark. That's when the shooting started. There was no more fuel for the cabin lights. It was running out, and a team of 7 senior Pakistani officials, high up in the government and police, said that they didn't know who was in charge, so they made no decision on having more fuel put in. And after the darkness came is when the shootout started and all the terror took place. That was in Pakistan. Now, the fourth major event in this series is in Turkey, where the synagogue was attacked, and that was attacked September the 7th, one day after the Pakistan hijacking, where people from India were singled out and murdered, specifically identified and wanted, and then shooting at random in the dark. Newsweek, September 16th, has the title, "Slaughter in the Synagogue, 19 Jews Gunned Down." Now, we have very close ties to the government of Turkey. The National Security Council has Robert Keith Gray of the public relations firm, the Powerhouse. Incidentally, Gray just sold his firm to another company and merged with Carl Boyer, B-Y-O-R. And in my article on the links of the Nazis to the John Kennedy murder, I write about Boyer and the Howard Hughes organization, and also J. Peter Grace and the connections to Nazi Germany, of Hughes to Nazi Germany, so that Robert Keith Gray's offices have just merged. Gray is very close to William Casey and Paul Laxalt and Ronald Reagan, and our other close ties to Turkey with the CIA are Paul Hensey, the CIA station chief in Turkey, who works closely with Alexander Haig, and Francesco Pazienza from the Italian Secret Service, close to Ronald Reagan, and Licio Gelli, who was at Reagan's inauguration, the man who masterminded the P2, the Masonic Lodge, the re-emergence of the Gestapo. He was in the Waffen SS. Gelli is in South America now. But Claire Sterling and Michael Ledeen of the National Security Council, Paul Hense, and the whole gang are very close to the Turkish government. In fact, the day that the plane was hijacked in Turkey, Michael Ledeen was on television for about an hour giving an interview about it. But these people worked with Frank Turpel, Robert Keith Gray's office worked under Henry Kissinger and with George Bush, CIA director also, with Task Force 157, with Frank Turple, who trained and bragged about training Ajah. So there's no coincidence that the shootout that took place when Pope John Paul II was killed shouldn't have to link to the same places or the gun locations or the training center of people involved in the Pakistan hijacking. And then the synagogue, the Turkish connections to the CIA and NATO are just overwhelming. Now, September the 7th, 1986 was, it wasn't in 86, September the 7th, 1972 was the Olympic Games massacre. And that's when Jewish athletes were killed in Munich, Germany. It was the first Olympics since Hitler's being in power, since 1936, the Olympics there. And there were strong links to the CIA, to George Habash, to our intelligence community, and to the PLO involved in killing Jews at the time of the Olympic Games. Now, one article I want to cite from the San Francisco Examiner regarding the synagogue is titled, Confusion Over Report on Synagogue, Witnesses Dispute Report. Istanbul, Turkey government is trying to identify two gunmen who sprayed with their machine guns, threw hand grenades at worshippers. The gasoline poured on victims, and then they were set ablaze. Interior Minister Yildirim Akbulut said the attack carried out was by two unidentified gunmen who were killed in the synagogue when the grenades went off, and he wanted to identify them. Members of the synagogue said, survivors said, that there were 4 terrorists and not 2. One person whose father was killed, Gabriel Saul, said that 4, not 2, as the government wanted to pass it off. One of them was 22 or 23 years old. I saw one of them running away from the synagogue after the attack, and a gentleman gal is seen in a shop opposite the synagogue, said 2 men ran away on foot. Now, this article says that the Turkish journalists now believe the government's version of the massacre was a ploy to put off any guard or any gunman who fled by not confirming that they are searching for them. But here's a punchline that is very important to all this. 2 Polish submachine guns were in the attack, and they determined the grenades were made by the Soviet Union. Now, Samuel Cummings, who has the largest supply organization of weapons of all sorts, buys Russian weapons and also Polish from all over the world. And he's the arms merchant whose locations are in Virginia and in London. He's the brother-in-law of Senator John Tower, who was instrumental in bringing Marina Oswald to Texas and passing up all obstacles to her getting there by June 1962. He's a supplier of weapons, but it's very important in these headlines to identify the weapons with, just as the shooting of the Pope, the Bulgarian connections, the KGB, to say these are Polish because Poland is an Iron Curtain country, and that the grenades were made by the Soviet Union to bring in the Soviet Union. Now, on top of all of that violence, we have, as I say, the Daniloff event, the affair carried in the newspapers, and the aftermath of all of this was similar or identical to when President Eisenhower wanted to meet with Nikita Khrushchev, and that meeting was called off in 1960 because of the Pentagon's decision to fly the U-2 flight and break up d'entente or any chance of peace talks. And these events, of course, are the same wedge, the identical way they're happening. It's almost like rereading history. It's a deja vu. September the 10th, Wall Street Journal, superpower clash over jailed reporter is bolstering the United States, the U.S., and the Soviet hardliners. The Monterey Herald, September the 10th, the arrest of Daniloff shifts the tone of the summit meeting. Los Angeles Herald, September the 11th, the Soviets and the United States raise the stakes in the Daniloff affair. And this goes into the conflicts and the confrontations, and whatever paper you take in whatever city you hear this, you're seeing it all in your newspapers, the tone of the summit, and so forth. Now, the next subject along these lines to follow this terrorism is the campaign of Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan has problems. We could spend the next year, till the end of the year, on the various lawsuits, cases, scandals, dirty business dealings that his people are involved with. And he is desperate to get the Senate, of course, the GOP Senate, filled with his own kind to make the judge appointments that he wants. And one of the things that people are not aware of that is very important is he will select the next director of the FBI. Before he retires, he has the selection. Mr. William Webster's time is up, and Ronald Reagan will make it. So there's a battlefield now for Reagan to get the courts filled, get the levels of the judges filled, the appeals courts, and the appointments, and not be stampeded or be asked questions by Democratic members of the House or Senate. The Senate is the important matter. Washington Times, which is Reverend Moon's paper, September the 5th, written by Jeremiah O'Leary, and this is while Reagan's up at the Eagle's Nest. Reagan ready to launch a 2-month campaign blitz. This is like Hitler's blitzkrieg. Another article, September the 3rd, Jack Anderson. Senate elections worry the White House. A bad case of political jitters. If they lose the Senate, there are grave implications for Reagan's programs. Another article, Houston Post, September the 7th. President opening drive to retain Senate control. Losing Senate would inflict Reagan with lame duckism. Will it be more than lame duckism? There's the Raymond Donovan case, a Paul Laxalt case with links to the mafia in Las Vegas. There's the Jackie Presser Teamsters story. About 100 other investigations, and we've gone into a lot of them on this broadcast. San Francisco Examiner, September 14th, John Jacobs article. No doubt about it, Senate is the battleground. If Democrats control the Senate, it would be simply impossible for Reagan to appoint his cronies. And Newsweek, September 15th, Senate toss-up. Fall schedule reads like a Baedeker to the battleground of states. This is literally a war, or preceding a war, depending how far Reagan can go. Now, the date of the synagogue massacre took place September the 7th, and then Ronald Reagan, that was on a Saturday, and Sunday Reagan leaves the Eagle's Nest in Santa Barbara, and he goes to Los Angeles to the Century City Hotel, where there's a $1.5 million dinner raised for Representative Ed Zschau of California, who's running against Alan Cranston. Reagan said, if we win this California Senate race, we will keep control of the United States Senate. Cranston versus Zschau. So there was this large dinner party at Century City. It was the day after the massacre where the Jews were killed in Turkey, where alleged Soviet grenades were used and Polish weapons. And at the dinner was a Rabbi Yale Butler, who writes for one of the Jewish newspapers in Los Angeles. Reagan has never had these big banquets with Jews, rabbis at his dinners. He's been very arm's distance from them and stayed away from them. But this is a campaign to get the Jewish vote against Cranston. So in comes Butler to give the invocation there, so he's visible with Ed Zschau. And preceding it, as I say, preceding the dinner, September the 5th, the Pakistan, the hijacking. September the 6th, the synagogue shooting. September the 7th, Sunday night, is the large dinner that opens up the Zschau event. And the San Francisco Examiner had a story, September the 9th, 1986, the following day. Zschau begins using terrorism as an issue against Cranston. This is in Santa Clara, where a dinner was given, a banquet where they raised $500,000 the next evening, and the chairman of the dinner was David Packard. The finance chairman for Ed Zschau is David Packard, former Secretary of Defense. Now, this is the way the story is. Representative Zschau had a lagging campaign against Senator Cranston until he finally stumbled upon a timely issue, terrorism. A $800,000 2-week TV campaign is underway where he will say that Democrat Alan Cranston opposed anti-terrorist bills. The ad was planned to alternate scenes of Zschau in a sweatshirt relaxed at Stanford campus at his alma mater. But with the sudden terrorist eruptions in Pakistan and Turkey, Zschau team abruptly dropped the Stanford scene and planned to do terrorist spots instead. We were incredibly lucky with the timing, said a Zschau campaign staffer. The Zschau attack comes after he had been receiving end of some nasty ads of Cranston. At a dinner where 900 people paid $500 each, with former Secretary of Defense David Packard putting on the dinner. Packard, an old Stanford classmate of Zschau. Zschau began his speech, and he said he will attack Cranston for bringing his idea of bringing terrorists to justice, that he's not for shooting them on the spot. He defined that. He said, while Zschau favored the Reagan administration policies he defined as including bringing terrorists to justice and preemption, Cranston was voting against getting tougher abroad. He spoke to his favorite audience of engineers, electronics industry, and so forth in the Silicon Valley. And he said, by luck, he has a campaign issue. It will be terrorism. and just magnify that throughout the United States, where every Senate seat is. With the Jewish vote, the sympathy, get tough on the terrorists. The Jews have been gunned down in the synagogue. They're hijacking planes. And keep in mind that our two allies, Turkey and Pakistan, it was in their states where the terrorism took place. And the benefit of all that will be the Senate races and Ronald Reagan to assure that he can keep supplying those NATO terrorists with the arms that they need. I'll take a 1-minute break and then go on to some very important matters, but that is a summary of this past week's events, if you can summarize it in 30 minutes. This is Mae Brussell, and it's the second half of a program named World Watchers, and it is the program series, continuous series, is number 771. And those events that I ran down very quickly are just an overview with a few of the articles and materials I've seen. I would like to do a lot more on each of them in detail, and I will as time allows, but it builds up to Ronald Reagan's coming off his mountain and then beginning to try to get the Senate vote so that there's no more stumbling blocks to any justices he appoints, the head of the FBI he will appoint, the policies, the money for weapons, or anything that he wants to do. He needs this Senate majority, and that was the introduction to his campaign. And if you think things don't happen like that, remember when Jerry Brown in this state was running against Pete Wilson, who became the senator from California. And we had an importation of 300 million fertile medflies, and he became the brunt of a lot of jokes. The people in the northern area of California became the brunt of malathion spraying done by Central Intelligence Agency airplanes, but the result of it was, and that was a war in this state literally, was to get a GOP senator in, and Pete Wilson was the recipient of all that, and the medfly story really has never been written up in detail the way it should. Now, the second half of this broadcast, I want to go into the implications of two articles that are on the front page of Wall Street Journal today. I had 300 other things I was going to cover, but I couldn't pass these up because they're so terribly important, and you can get them right now at your library and copy these articles. Wall Street Journal, September 15th, 1985, has a front column on one side of the front page, and then the entire page, not another column, but a whole full page by Jonathan Whitney. Now, Whitney, many of you know his name from the articles on the Nugan Bank. He wrote a book several years ago called Endless Enemies, which is a fantastic book. And when I saw the size of this article, I looked in to see, well, who wrote this? And, of course, it was Jonathan Whitney. The Wall Street Journal must respect him a lot. And I want to go on to the subject of the article, because this article has to do with the people very influential with the Teamsters, two men, Merv Adelson, who recently married Barbara Walters, and Erwin Molaski. And the title of the article is Seeds of Success. Two Lorimar officials have had ties to men of the underworld repute. And I'm not going to even begin to do anything but touch the just the edges of this story and the implications of the story, and then share and outline it and do more with you later. Now, Jeff Gerth of Sundance, he wrote for Sundance magazine, and it was closed after his brilliant article, had tried to expose the links of La Costa and the organized crime syndicate, and he published an article in Penthouse, and it went on for a long, long time, a suit, Mo Dalitz and the organized crime figures suing Penthouse magazine. It was an endless suit for 5 or 6 years, multi-million-dollar lawsuit of people in La Costa, California, who were funded by the Teamsters, trying to say they were not linked to organized crime. And this article mentions that lawsuit. So it's interesting that after fighting it for 5 years out of Penthouse magazine, that the Wall Street Journal chooses to use the entire page, page 18, and I hope there's more that comes tomorrow and the next day, about the Teamsters and La Costa. And why are they so important? When Jeff Gerth wrote his article, he made in Sundance, and I should make copies and reprint it. I'll copy and see how expensive it is. And most of you listeners, some of you have it, most of you don't know it. And it has detailed descriptions of the connections in Bahamas with the land group, the mafia, Richard Nixon, William Rogers, who just headed and covered up the Challenger explosion, and Bahamas, the headquarters of organized crime, and using that area for not only for the pleasure and profit of gambling, but it also was the nest in the 1940s of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor that set the scene for later when the mafia moved in there, and they were close to Rudolf Hess and Dr. Hermann Urban from Germany, the SS Gestapo, who was the Gestapo chief over Errol Flynn, while he was co-starring with Ronald Reagan, and I'll do more of that in a few moments. The Bahamas were important to the British and to the world syndicate for profits of gambling, prostitution, and political right-wingism, mostly. The political right using assassinations as a means to get up into power. So Jeff Gerst had written about William Rogers and Nixon, the Bahama connections, and John Connally, who was involved in ways that I'll detail later and have before with the Kennedy assassination. But this was the nucleus of a hit team operation as well as drugs for the purpose of putting power into the hands of these fascist dictators. So now this article comes out in the Wall Street Journal in 1986, and it begins with discussions of the Lorimar productions. Lorimar, and it breaks down the studios they own, the Lorimar plans, and their television studios and their affiliates, CBS in Detroit and the CBS in Miami. And it has a chart of their connections. As I say, I'll outline it for you. And it mentions Mo Dalitz in this article. Mo Dalitz is very close to Paul Laxalt, very, very close. Paul Laxalt has been spoken of as a possible president of the United States, and he's part of that Nevada faction with that non-existent Howard Hughes who was there, which was really the CIA and the Defense Department, and Dalitz and Laxalt worked closely with Robert Mayhew, and that ties into the assassinations of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King that were part of the Permindex operation. Why this is coming out now, we can't figure out yet, but it's going to lead somewhere. Maybe it's George Bush's revenge against Laxalt, who Reagan has to favor, because Reagan is part of that inner team, that this work is being allowed to come out in the Wall Street Journal at this time. That's just a good guess of the underpinnings, because George Bush isn't the little softy you think he is. Now, G. Robert Blakey, the chief counsel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, who covered up the murder of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King the second time around and locked all the material up for 75 years, G. Robert Blakey was the attorney for Mo Dalitz during his long lawsuit. And he never should have been head of the House Select Committee. And again, it opens up the whole investigation of the Kennedy assassination if the attorney and the mafia are all one. And then Blakey writes a book that the mafia killed Kennedy, covering up the Nazi connections, but also covering up LaCosta and Laxalt and Mayhew and Dalitz and the whole umbrella organization of plans to murder anybody who was in the way. It didn't have to just be John Kennedy, but he happened to be the President of the United States, and that was the most dramatic example of the way these teams work. Louis Nizer is close to this LaCosta group, to Mo Dalitz. He's a well-known attorney in New York who wrote the introduction to the Warren Report. He's closely affiliated with them, and he was also invited by NASA to be the attorney for the space astronauts when the space program began. And in the Torba document, you read where Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger from Nazi Germany had a role in the murder of John Kennedy and were instrumental through Bell Helicopter and Michael Payne to effect a convincing cover-up that would make it look like Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. Now, they pulled a couple of jokes on us, and there's a little interlanguage going between these groups that may be too subtle. It isn't subtle for me, and I want to share it with you and go back to the story of Lorimar later. On the 20th anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy, the news media was filled with the program Dallas and Lorimar production, close to Mo Dalitz and the mafia group. You read the article, the Wall Street Journal, and think of their connections. And they produced the TV show Dallas. The question was, who killed JR? And every newspaper and every magazine and every talk show was filled with that. November 22nd, 1963, the night before, I believe, was that program, Who Killed JR? And the title of the program was Dallas, and it was produced by Merv Adelson and Erwin Molaski. And it was a little in-joke because nobody was asking who killed John Kennedy, and was taking over from the question of who killed John Kennedy on the 20th anniversary of the death of Kennedy. And it had more to do with JR and the Dalitz show, so that it was a total diversionary from a real assassination to this piece of fiction. And the piece of fiction is titled by the very men who are involved with those people from Vegas that moved down to La Costa that have a role in this whole web network that goes to many places and many islands. But the article that Wall Street Journal has today by Jonathan Whitney just again begins to get into those people, which hasn't been done since Jeff Gerst got into them and studied them a few years ago. Now, it may be very coincidental, and it may be very funny or subtle, but I'm going to throw out just a story I've had in the news for the past few weeks, which is silly, crazy, but not really, because what you think is crazy in this news, when you keep it long enough, has some interesting code words or connections that I never pass off. I don't take seriously unless something comes up. But recently I read that Rudolf Hess, the lone criminal, war criminal, since World War II, who's kept in Spandau, Rudolf Hess, who was the most important man behind Adolf Hitler, who laid the groundwork for taking over South America in the 1930s, set up Nazi networks in all the South American countries, and hopefully then would move from South America to Central North America. Hess is still in Spandau. He's 92. And according to recent news accounts, and my favorite was from Reverend Moon's paper, where Arnaud de Borchgrave is the editor, it says Hess uses Dallas, the TV movie, to pass his time in Spandau. And it says Rudolf Hess is only allowed to see only two TV movies, Dallas and Dynasty, in Spandau prison. His TV is limited to these. He's allowed to watch only those two, or Black Forest Clinic, or the soccer matches. Now, the soccer matches is another connection to this Odessa network. And I think it's interesting that the persons closely affiliated with the Mo Dalitz, Paul Axel, CIA, Howard Hughes connections, working with the producers of the program Dallas, and this particular person is locked up in their prison and may be coincidental. Now, the real Hess, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's chief right-hand man, who was the brains behind him, and Martin Bormann was the banking brains behind Hitler, Hess flew to the estate of Lord Hamilton. That was May the 5th, 1941. That was before we ever got into the war. Pearl Harbor didn't happen until December. Lord Hamilton and his operations were very closely linked later to the Oppenheimer family with the diamonds in South Africa, and the connections that brought Henry Kissinger to the United States to join in the United States Army, U.S. intelligence, and then he was sent back to Europe as the war was winding down, and was present from the Battle of the Bulge in December of 44 until May of 45, when Kissinger was put in a castle and was in charge of people like Otto Skorzeny and Klaus Barbie and top Nazis. He was just a young man. He hadn't got to Harvard yet. Now, Rudolf Hess flew away to Scotland, and previously to that, he was very close, as I say, to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who moved to the Bahamas. There was talk that he had been to the Bahamas. And as I say, this was the headquarters, or one of the stopping places, of Dr. Urban to the Bahamas, to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as he took his yacht and many trips with Errol Flynn, where they worked with top Nazis in Mexico and in that area. And Urban also was active in Europe and around the world with his Gestapo work. In 1940 to 1942, you remember Ronald Reagan was making movies for the Army, and he even hinted at the reunion of the OSS just a few months ago that he possibly worked in the OSS when he was making Army pictures and duplications of Peenemünde, where Werner von Braun and Dornberger worked as Nazi war scientists with their space rocket engineers, known war criminals that were brought to the United States. He was in Desperate Journey and Santa Fe, those two movies with Errol Flynn, and his earliest contacts with Errol Flynn in Hollywood were the same time when Flynn was active in the Gestapo. Now, just recently, German President Richard von Weizsäcker has been asking to get Rudolf Hess out. I've just been reading a book given to me by a long friend and researcher, a world watcher, called Pius XII and the Third Reich. Richard von Weizsäcker's father was the liaison from Adolf Hitler to the Vatican, to Pope Pius XII. And this book is just filled, it's practically about Richard von Weizsäcker's father. Weizsäcker is the current president of Germany, and his father was the liaison to the Vatican from Hitler, and he's pushing to get Hess out of that building. Also, there's a book out now. It was published in 1984, but it's available, and I can tell you where if you want to contact me, called The Windsor Secret, New Revelations of Nazi Connections by Peter Allen, Stein and Day, 1984. I just mention it because this Hess, with his, maybe it's a joke, they say he watches Dallas, but there's even more about Hess that is also interesting. The people that are keeping them, and you might have read this in the paper, are having him write diaries. He keeps a diary, and they say the historians will never see it. As soon as he has filled these 3 volumes, they give him 3 volumes at a time, they take them away from him and they burn them, and they bring him more, and then they burn those. We really don't know if they're burning them, and we don't know if it's Hess, because there's been doctors who said he doesn't have the same war wounds as the Hess from World War I, and there's a strong belief by some people that the real Rudolf Hess could have gone on down to South America and organized, along with Licio Gelli and people from the Vatican and the White House and from the European NATO countries that put in these military dictatorships and have supported them all along. He may still or could be the organizer of these things. And so he writes these diaries and they throw them away, and they may be just gibberish that have nothing to do with the past because it may not be Hess. And also I've mentioned before on World Watchers that I read that when Hess dies, he's 92, the Spandau prison has been ordered to be destroyed, and the demolition team are ready to place some kind of whatever it is that blows it up, and there's no chance of any fingerprints or remains of the building being there. So what he's writing is being thrown away, and where he's staying for this long time is going to be destroyed. And also Helmut Kohl, the current Chancellor of Germany, who literally forced Ronald Reagan to go to a cemetery at Bitburg to honor the Waffen-SS before the entire world. Kohl and Weizsäcker was just in power at the time, pushing the President of the United States to these ceremonies and these banquets, a banquet that Weizsäcker gave in Germany, and he wreath-laying at Bitburg. They're working to get Hess out of this jail. Whether or not he is Hess, we don't know, and maybe it's just a figure of speech that they want him out. Now, there's one other thing he's allowed to watch besides Dallas and Dynasty, and that's the soccer teams. And that's interesting because Henry Kissinger, who was so close to Lord Hamilton and that group, he was a young man, but stayed friendly, I'm sure, after the war. The group that where Hess knew to land, he was a pilot, landed on the property in Scotland of Lord Hamilton. The very people around Henry Kissinger have that worked with Hess have also, with Kissinger's encouragement and so forth, had Kissinger being very active with the soccer games in Europe. He's a very big wig with the soccer games, and he works with Mr. Agnelli of the Permindex organization. That was the Clay Shaw, John Connolly, the Bahamas group that set up the assassination teams of political people. Agnelli is the head of Fiat. Henry Kissinger and Agnelli are very close and go to the soccer games in Europe. And this is one of the ways that Kissinger is head of Kissinger Associates when he's not Secretary of State or National Security Advisor, travels all over the world and participates in soccer. And Hess is allowed to see Dallas, produced by this team from Texas and California and Nevada, and he's allowed to see soccer. And Henry Kissinger is closely linked to soccer, and he's used this, as I say, for one of his international networks to travel around and do the businesses he wants to do. Now, there was an article that I have of Henry Kissinger, a picture of him at a soccer game. And this isn't coincidental. This is an article written by Mark Sonnenblick, January 24th, 1986, this past January. And it's a description of Henry Kissinger's links to fascism and the death squads in Argentina and the soccer connections to those and his affiliation for the soccer games. This just came out 1986, but Henry Kissinger was also at the soccer game in Europe where so many people were pounced on by the British and murdered. Remember the terrible semi-mini Holocaust that took place. Kissinger was there with Mr. Agnelli. This article says the story begins 8 years ago, and it's being unfolded just now, and it took place 8 years ago, but it shows the role of Kissinger with soccer, which isn't far removed from what Rudolf Hess was setting up in South America, or the Hess who watches soccer now at Spandau. The story begins 8 years ago. The article begins, it began June 9th, 1978, when $250,000 in money was sent to Lima, Peru, from Bogota, Colombia, from from a cocaine mafia chieftain who's now in jail in Madrid, pending extradition to the United States. And I guess that's why it came out now, because it's 1986 and he's waiting to be sent to this country. On June the 21st, just a few days later, 2 weeks later, week and a half later, Henry Kissinger sat with General George Videla, sentenced in December 85 to life imprisonment, and other members of the Argentine junta, cheering as the crack Peruvian soccer team miraculously turned itself into a sieve and allowed Argentina to score 6-0 for Peru. This oversized victory allowed Argentina to become the world champion, to create a climate of euphoria which enabled the corrupt and butchering junta to remain in power several years longer. A few days later, the Argentine Peronist magazine Linea accused the regime of bribing the Peruvian team to drop its defenses. This Roman circus was known among sports championships as having been paid off the Peruvian players of $250,000, and the Bogota suitcase would have remained secret, but it showed up in a flight to New York City where it was discovered by the United States Customs. The person who had it, Mr. Pardo, admitted he was hired by a Rodriguez for testimony, and he went before Judge Irving Kaufman, and he testified about what he was doing and how the money came about. And on the basis of his testimony, and Kaufman became the chairman of President Reagan's Commission on Organized Crime, he said that in 1981 he ruled that the mafia had a better claim to the $250,000 than the Colombian government. That Colombia was going to deliver it to Peru and for blowing the game, but it belonged to the mafia and mafia chieftain. Then it goes on, Henry Kissinger made Lima, Peru, his only stop on the way to Buenos Aires on June 20th, 1978, before the game. He had a private meeting at the airport with U.S. Ambassador Harry Schlauterman, his protege and his most adept specialist in covert operations. Schlauterman was appointed by Ronald Reagan in 1986 to become U.S. ambassador to Brazil. It was the first time Kissinger had stepped foot in Peru since February 1976, where as Secretary of State he was forced to sit through a long indictment of the evils of his foreign policies delivered by General Miguel de la Flor, Peru's nationalist foreign minister. Kissinger was so enraged and mortified and he was terrified by Peru that he said that he left there proclaiming a special relationship with Brazil 2 days later and turning his back on Peru. Then he goes to Argentina, where the championship was 6-0, and it allowed the Argentinians to become well known in the soccer team and to travel and have this honor at the time the death squads were administering their terror. Now, some suspected that President Francisco Morales Bermudez had insulted Henry Kissinger in Peru. He blamed Kissinger for facilitating and making the 1975 military coup in Peru, which ousted General Velasco Alvarado and put him in power. He blamed that coup on Henry Kissinger's shenanigans, and it's down in Peru where Stefano Della Calle, the head of terror who inherited all of his techniques from Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's most dangerous man, and working with our CIA, he's down there now spreading the terror and shooting judges and people in Peru to force another coup in that country. The article goes on, Kissinger arrived at Buenos Aires airport for the game. He pontificated with a smile. He said, I don't know much about football, but Argentina will be the champion. It was a soccer game. Once again, the soothsayer was showing off his great wisdom, as he did when he predicted that Italian Premier Aldo Moro and Pakistani Prime Minister Ali Bhutto that they would meet violent death for opposing his policies. He told them that, and of course, both of them are killed, and you see what's happened in Pakistan since then. Kissinger gloated about the World Cup that would go and help the good image of Argentina. A special agency was created to prepare for the World Cup. They spent $520 million, not counting airports and infrastructure, in game preparations. Most of the money, $520 million, was never accounted for. General Omar Akhtis, an army construction expert for honesty, was assassinated 48 hours before he was to head the agency. A bomb exploded at the house of a finance official who had challenged the expenditures at the exact moment that Argentina had scored its fourth goal against Peru. His house was bombed. The mastermind of Operation Argentine Champion 1978 was Navy junta member Admiral Emilio Massacre, with whom Kissinger had a 50-minute secret meeting June 24, 1978, the UPI reported. Massacre was later exposed in Italy as the key Argentine in the propaganda to the P2 Masonic Lodge terrorism and banking scandal. And P2, you see, was headed up by Licio Gelli, who was at Ronald Reagan's inauguration. All these people have close links to the Reagan administration, and of course, Pakistan, as I say, with the murder of Bhutto, Kissinger effected a coup there as he had done in Peru in 1975. Massacre was head of in Argentina, the Free Masonic Lodge terrorism and banking scandal. That was the Banco Ambrosiano in Italy. Massacre was sentenced to life imprisonment December the 9th, this past year, 1985, for having supervised the torture center at the Navy Mechanics School, located right at the shadow of the stadium while Kissinger sat next to him, cheering Argentina's final victory. And this is a place where they burned people alive and tore their limbs out, as they did by the Savak in Iran that Henry Kissinger also put in power. And this article goes on, after all the evidence was in, Massacre was convicted on numerous counts of homicide, kidnapping, torture, and theft, which took place at the same time before and during and after the World Cup, while they were cheering on and paying Peru to lose so that Argentina would be known for their athletics and their abilities to forget the junta. Kissinger sat in the junta box with Massacre, with President Jorge Videla, Brigadier Orlando Agasti, and Treasury Minister Jose Martina de Hoz. Videla, his other partner that sat with him, was also sentenced July the 9th for even more brutal crimes from 1976 to 81 in the dirty war that Massacre had given, was also sentenced for. He was given perpetual reclusion with hard labor, solitary confinement. Agasti, the Air Force junta member, was sentenced to only 4.5 years, since the Air Force under his command had fewer proven cases of barbarism. Kissinger's best friend in Argentina, the Oxford, Harvard-educated de Hoz, miraculously avoided being jailed, although more than one judge put out a warrant for his arrest for economic sabotage, charging him with at least $5 billion to $35 billion in foreign debt, which he saddled Argentina with for 5 years in office as being fraudulent. He's still on the loose, as is Licio Gelli. De Hoz's properties are under judicial embargo. De Hoz was not tried in the dirty war, which covered up the multiple economic crimes of the Patria Financiera. He represented them, and despite the fact that his hit list names victims that were found, he was naming victims that were found in his office, the hit list. Kissinger helped Warner Communications of Atlanta invest in the soccer games with the money that they made from the soccer games to import soccer star Pelé from Brazil to play in New York Cosmos in 1975 and to make Trilateral Commission member Jimmy Carter president the next year. And the article goes then how Warner Communications and Kissinger's friends hired Mick Jagger to entertain and consult with Cosmos 1978 to make a big event. And the article goes on about Henry Kissinger setting up the Mexico City soccer games this past year. Kissinger had his hands on the ball in May 1983. He got himself appointed chairman of the United States World Cup Organizing Committee to get games held in the United States. And through the World Cup Organizing Committee, set up in 1983, Kissinger goes around and plays patsies with people who are killing at the same time, taking billions from their country, putting in their dictatorships are in, and soccer has been a big cover for a lot of those activities. Kissinger had President Reagan kick a soccer ball around the White House lawn. Kissinger did nothing, but it set up his ability to navigate or interpret or to be part of the Mexican soccer games or wherever he goes, appointed with this nice position. Whatever it is, I know he doesn't play the game, he doesn't play it, but he's chairman of the United States World Cup Organizing Committee. And I bring this up because it's really ironic that Hess is watching Dallas on the one hand, that has its connections to all of these assassination teams that I've talked about in the crime syndicate and the overview of the Permindex operation behind the wiping off of heads of states to put in dictatorships. And Hess has connections to Lord Hamilton in Scotland, whose estate he went directly to, who became the person providing the passports and the ease with which Henry Kissinger went to the United States, then went into Army intelligence, worked with top Nazis, went to Harvard, and then began to work with the World Affairs Council and make State Department policies, and has his Watching Soccer, which has its connections all to those things. And that in these little articles published by Arnaud de Bourgegrave in Reverend Moon's paper, the details of the Hess story just seem to smack of a lot of coincidences. Also, I want to say that in the same paper today, Wall Street Journal, I only have about 10 seconds to do it, another large article that's the front page of Section 2. Lawyers for the Hunt family have a history of stirring up trouble. I haven't outlined the troubles of Lorimar, Hunt, and the whole Hunt family in Dallas, the whole chain of them. I'll do some of that next week, and the links to the Kennedy assassination there. And the attorney bringing their trial to Texas is Judge Barefoot Sanders, who was the U.S. attorney in Dallas at the time Kennedy was murdered. So, again, the Hunts set up what they called an American volunteer group, which was an assassination team to set up in deserts with the Minutemen and the Klan to kill American political people by various means, simulating heart attacks where they would pass over. That was one of their expertise, described in Spooks by Jim Hogan. But here are the Hunts in Wall Street Journal, a Section 2 front page, and on the front page of Wall Street Journal today is Jonathan Whitney's article on the Mo Dallas La Costa connections, which he doesn't jump right to the Kennedy assassination, but step 1 or 2 or 3 is understanding this team, then go to G. Robert Blakey and get an overgood view of how things are covered up the second time. But time is running out quickly now. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week to do some of the articles like this in detail.